Well, it's that time.
Oh, my.
All right.
Amanda's starting on time.
Yeah, that's right.
Somewhat. Somewhat. So good evening. I'm going to stand up.
Good evening, hi Jane, hi Dennis.
All right. Oh, quick. We're just about to begin. It's getting good. So, let's talk about last week, which was 7 days ago.
Thank you.
Yes.
You're gonna tell us that,
Tuesday night.
you're gonna
Now,
tell us that Yom Kippur is this week too?
I don't know if that's true. Do you remember, I had this card in my hand, and I drew some corners on it, folded one over. I know you really can't quite see it with that corners. Why did I do that? Go ahead, yes. Right, remember we read a passage in the book of Leviticus which said, leave the corners of your field for the poor, the homeless, the hungry, right? And so what was the question?
How big is the
How big is my corner?
What's a corner? Is that a corner? See this? Is that a corner or is, which is a corner, right? This one or that one? Now, why did I read that? We read the passage, then what do we do? We read the passage from Leviticus, but then what do we do? Where do we find an answer to such a question? In
The Mishnah.
the Mishnah. Remember, we were looking at the beginnings of Reform Judaism. So my point was last time that we were going to talk about a transformational moment in Jewish history and what transformed things. What was the cutoff point? What was the point that resulted? Forced change.
The destruction of the temple.
Right, in the year 70, right? In the year 70, the Romans destroyed the temple, and it was a cataclysm, a catastrophe, because we also looked at texts out of the Bible, which assumed that the way in which you conducted yourself, if you were a Jewish person, had to do with a central shrine at the temple, a priesthood, and sacrifices. So when all of that left, either it was the end, or what was required was a huge effort to transform and renew and almost reform and remake Judaism. And that was done by the rabbis. So you might say that just as the Christianity which people celebrate here is not New Testament Christianity, it's built on it, but it's Christianity which has developed over 2,000 years. Similarly, Judaism is based on the Hebrew Bible, but it's not the Hebrew Bible. It's the Hebrew Bible plus all that stuff which developed, right? So it's like there's biblical Judaism, and you could say there's biblical Christianity too, and then there's post-biblical. Right? There's biblical and there's post-biblical Judaism, and we call this post-biblical Judaism rabbinic Judaism because the guys who did it were the rabbis. So it's rabbinic Judaism. Now, and so we looked at, remember I handed out copies of that, of the Mishnah, and we saw how the rabbis made Judaism. So they took a verse like, leave the corners, and they're the ones who said, well, what's a corner? And they had a whole conversation about the nature of charity. But before we got to that, remember we talked about, you remember what we talked about? What were the other areas where they had to they had to figure out what's wrong. They couldn't do sacrifices, so they said, we'll either study them and read them aloud, or what will we substitute? Prayers. We'll substitute prayers. And then we read about the Shema, Hear, O Israel. We read about how that was to be said, when, where, whenever. And remember I gave you the example also of what holiday, which is coming up?
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur, yes. Yes, Yom Kippur. And where the Bible just says, the 10th day of the month, and you shall afflict yourselves. The rabbi said, well, what does that mean? What does afflict mean? And then they went to town and said, we gave body to it. So what was the theme song of that thing? No, it wasn't. It actually wasn't because tradition was cut away. So it's the end of tradition, and what was the song? I played around with
I
it.
did,
Yes,
listen.
you did.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
laughed along with you, but.
There's a hole in the bucket, there's a hole in the bucket. And so the rabbis had a hole in their bucket, and they filled it with Judaism. Modern, well, post-biblical Judaism. So any comments or questions about that? Any thoughts?
Apologies.
Wait, you weren't here last week, forget it. Go ahead.
Either.
Go ahead.
However, I do make it to Rosh Hashanah services this year.
Me too. Go.
My question is that if, prior to the destruction of the temple, there were God-fearers and a lot of Hebrew people in exile. If the Hebrew folks in Rome, for example, how did they maintain their faith and their...
We're not going to go over that. Through the synagogue,
Quiet.
which was a growing institution. I'm sorry, but there were a growing institution of the synagogue, and that was sort of growing. And then when the temple went, then the synagogue was there.
Yeah.
That's what they did.
The question was there a model that the Jews used?
No, as long as the temple was around, it was okay.
But once that left,
Then there's a hole in the bucket, and that's what required a reform, a response. So remember, we're doing all this because we sort of, Tom and I had conceived this notion that ultimately, here we are, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So if you ever want to change, that was change. There had been a lot of change in Christianity before, but that's a huge change. So sort of to back that up and say, well, what's this whole thing about change in religious tradition? We thought we'd start a little bit earlier than 1517. So our first conversation then was about the year 70 plus, how the rabbis respond when there's a hole in their bucket, and they have to replant the whole thing. They have to transplant it, and they have to make it something altogether new and different. It's got roots, but it's got to grow, and it grows and grows and grows. Now, this week, we're going to begin with a question. Who are these people, and what are they doing in your church?
They're not, they're images of them, and they're Hasidic, and probably very Orthodox.
So, who are they? I'm a Jew,
Yeah.
and they're Jewish. So, how did they get here? Or, better question, how did I get here? So what I want to talk about today is these guys and me, and how this ever happened. Because you've seen pictures of these guys, or if you've been in Long Meadow, you've seen Orthodox Jews roaming around, or in the larger cities, right? So you would characterize, if you saw one of these guys, that guy's Jewish, definitely. If you saw me walking in them, you wouldn't necessarily know that I'm Jewish, but I am. So we want to figure out how do they connect to me, and how do we get to a circumstance in which I look like me and I'm Jewish, and they look like them and they're Jewish. So we'll leave my buddies here. They're watching. Be careful.
Are any of them wearing yarmulkes?
Yes.
Under the head.
A hat.
Definitely.
A hat.
Very
So, something has to happen so that, I can tell you that the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah didn't look like this, because they lived in the year 200. But still, something happens so that these guys, who look very Jewish, and I'm Jewish, so something's got to happen here. And what we want to talk about is another pivotal change. The year 70 occasioned a pivotal change, required a pivotal change. And what we're going to talk about today is another such change. You could say the early rabbis reformed Judaism. I'm using it as a verb. They reformed Judaism to make it grow for their period of time. And what we're going to talk about today is another way in which Judaism is reformed about 250 years ago. And it results in modern Judaism. So something happens around 250 years ago. Whoops, I'm trying to save paper here. Let's see if I can have the glue work here. And it requires a response. So there's got to be some response to something that happens about 200, 250 years ago. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's mammoth, and it characterizes the whole modern Jewish world. It's this reform which is required. So what do you think that is that happens to 250 years ago? This is not fair. I'm being cute here. There's almost a new religion, and there's a new politics. So the almost new religion is called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment results in politics like the world has never known before. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, and it's the Enlightenment in Europe which leads to the changes that give you me. Well, it does. In many, many ways it does. So first of all, a little review of the Enlightenment. Does somebody want to offer a sort of a definition of the Enlightenment?
Partly it was the age of reason.
Yes, I don't think everybody heard that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Partly it was what was called the age of reason.
So say some more about that. Whatever you can remember. The Enlightenment kind of goes along with the age
You
of
had
reason.
people who were questioning what was divine. You had people who were questioning religion. You had enormous political upheaval in some parts of the world. French Revolution.
Science.
Science is making, great progress, but a lot of it is just a kind of, the human mind is much more powerful than we ever thought it was. And so instead of listening for the church to tell them what to think, people started thinking for themselves.
Hence the age of reason. So we can characterize that as an event, sort of a, it's not like the people in the Enlightenment said, oh, it's the Enlightenment. But after the fact, people became aware of the fact that there was a certain circumstances, certain ideas were adrift or around in the world in the 16 and 1700s, which you would characterize as the age of reason or the Enlightenment. So let's pass this around. If I could. And you may say this has nothing to do, actually there's another one. I've got it for sure. Okay. So the Enlightenment almost becomes its own kind of religion, as it were. So let's take a look at this text. A couple of things. And you could say, to narrow it down, the Enlightenment gives rise ultimately to the emancipation of the Jews. I'm talking American emancipation. So we'll talk about what that means, okay? Those are my two big words, Enlightenment and emancipation. So just to give a sense of the emancipation, I'm on the side which says the Enlightenment. That's where I am. A new way of thinking about the world. Some of this I designed when I was teaching a class at Springfield College, so it's a little juvenile. Okay.
I thought you were going to say it's a little above us.
I taught at Springfield College, it's not above you. Okay, so John Locke, you see his dates, was an English philosopher. He's considered the first of the British empiricists, which means that he would only accept as true things which he could see with his own eyes, which he could see, test, prove. It had to be in front of him, and it had to be demonstrated was demonstrably true, or else he wouldn't buy it, right? He wouldn't believe something because someone said, you should believe in this, because I told you to. It's a good thing. He's widely regarded as one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers, and the word Enlightenment comes from the notion, the notion that the Middle Ages were dark ages, when there was not much learning or new learning. It was acceptable. Whatever was accepted was you learned what you had to learn. You didn't investigate new things. The Earth, all the planets flow around the Earth, stuff like that. So Locke's writings influenced the American revolutionaries. This influenced by the American Declaration of Independence. So here's a little piece of Locke, 2 quotes of his, which I think illustrate exactly what the Age of Reason was all about. So let's read them. They're in italics. And I'm going to ask you, why would this make any difference to the world of religion, to the church, and why would Locke's statements matter to Jews? Though Jews didn't read it at this time and place if they weren't doing so. But someone want to read who hasn't read before? Someone wise?
He's looking
There's
at
no one
you,
here.
Mike.
There's no one here. All right, someone who's not so wise. Go ahead. Yes. Red glasses. Win the day. Win the day. Just the 2 quotes.
Yep. He that believes without having any reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies, but rather seeks truth as he ought, not pays the obedience, nor pays the obedience due to his Maker.
Now, what is he saying here? This is a pretty radical thing. That was perfect. But what is he saying? It's not that hard. Just I don't want to make it so hard.
You're caught up in your own thoughts about the truth.
Right?
You're not looking for outside validation.
Right. If you believe something without any reason, you're a dummy. And you're not using your reason. You're in error. You're not a dummy. You're in error and you're not using your reason. Let's do the next one. Go ahead, please.
God, when he makes a prophet, does not unmake the man. He leaves all his faculties in the natural state to enable him to judge of his inspirations, whether they be of divine original or no. Reason must be our last judge and guide in everything.
All right, so what's he saying here? He's certainly saying that reason is our preeminent ability, but besides that, he's actually saying something additional about God.
Letting you make your own decisions, letting you figure out what is true, what's not true.
Right? God, even when God makes a prophet, he doesn't undo the human reason, the prophet's ability to reason. And so reason is critical. Now, what is that? If reason's critical and central to the human enterprise, what is that saying to the church?
Christianity was saying this is what you are to believe, not letting you think for yourself.
Right.
You must do exactly what was said.
Right.
Where I've gotten in trouble for years. What religion I was.
So this is saying to the church, reason is the central faculty of human beings. Reason must be our last judge and guide in everything. If it doesn't stack up to your sense of right and wrong, to your reason, then it's not true. This is a problem for the church. Why is this, or what does this say, if you take it a few extra steps, what does it say about or for Jews? What are the implications of this? Reason is our last judge and guide in everything. It's the natural thing for us. What does it say about Jews?
Being told a lot of the same things, not with the Christianity aspect, that this is what you should believe, these are our traditions, this is what you should observe. There are no other traditions outside that you should observe.
But what would John Locke, if John Locke followed this through, what would he have to think about Jews?
That this was not correct either.
What?
He would question what they're telling him.
No, I'm not being clear. If John Locke thinks that reason is a central human faculty, what conclusion is he going to have to draw about Jews? Where are Jews living in the year 1600 all across Europe? Where are they? How are they living? They're in ghettos. They're mainly in ghettos, and they aren't citizens of any of the countries where they live. And they're in ghettos. They're limited to what they can do. They can't own land. They can't do this. They can't do that. If John Locke maintains that reason is a central faculty,
They're not using theirs.
no, it's not that they're not using theirs. We're not letting them use theirs. And if reason is the central faculty, then, and they're humans and we're humans, then they've got just as much as we do. So how come they're in ghettos and we're putting them there? You follow that?
Yeah.
Liberating for them.
You bet. Read the next statement. I don't know who wrote this, but it's a godsend to the Jews. Because as soon as you read this, you want to read it, hon?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Oh, I can't believe that. Keep going.
That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So there's a straight shot from John Locke, who talks about freedom as a result of our all having reason, to the Declaration of Independence. Because if we all have reason, then we're all equal. Everyone starts with the same ability. We all have reason. We can all do it. And that all men are created equal. Certain inalienable rights. Now, it's not a straight shot, but it's a pretty straight shot. Can you
Yeah.
see how it goes, though? Locke, reason is central, and reason is human. Well, therefore, all humans have reason. All humans are equal. Holy cow. You got a Declaration of Independence. Next thing you know, someone's liable to say, wait, this must apply to Jews. It takes them a long time to figure out it applies to women. And a long time that it applies to African Americans. I know that. But it's right in there, and once you've written it on paper, it's kind of unavoidable. So, and then you get the French Revolution, based on Locke and others. What do they say? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Well, if that doesn't mean that the Jews deserve to be free and the Jews deserve to be equal and the Jews are our brothers, it doesn't mean anything. So, what we're saying here is that the Enlightenment, typified by John Locke, who believes in reason as a central category, that's what human beings are all about, leads to the notion that all men are created equal, leads to the notion of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and it's going to create, here's our change, it's going to result in Europeans reluctantly sometimes having to say, well, what are the Jews doing in ghettos? And how come the Jews have to live like they were in another century, and they can't do this, and they can't do that, and they can't do this, and they can't do that? We better emancipate the Jews. Emancipate meaning freedom. So we're going to take down the ghettos, and we're going to make Jews into, what are they going to become?
Citizens.
Yes, Jews are going to become citizens. Okay, so this is all a great idea. Try something else here. It's falling off. Hold on, try this. I'm being a bit stubborn not to any other piece of paper. I'm gonna come and cut this up and use it for memo pads.
Oh, no, you never throw anything away.
Not paper, I haven't used a new pad of paper in years. Okay, can you see how the emancipation, Locke, and then ultimately, so the Enlightenment, rather, is an intellectual event that leads to political change, right? The American and the French revolutions. Wow. The emancipation is going to lead to another revolution, which is the emancipation of the Jews. And this is going to be big, big stuff. So how do you think Jews are going to react to emancipation? I get a, how come?
Because along with that means exposure to the other. Whereas you're within the ghetto, you can control your own culture. But as the ghetto's walls break down and you're intermingled with the larger culture, then the larger culture has more of an effect on you.
So some Jews are going to say, they're going to say, no, we don't want to be emancipated. Some may say, and there are going to be some Jews who are going to think it's a great thing, right? Obviously. But can you see that it's not necessarily the case that everybody, when they hear about emancipation, would say, great idea, let's go get them. A number of people are going to say, this is really problematic. So how is it problematic? Let's talk about some examples. It could mean that inside the ghetto, we're our own masters, and we do Judaism. You know, our rest day is Saturday, and if we want to rest on Saturday and open our stores the other 6 days of the week, it's fine. If the ghetto's gone, what?
Someone else open on the Sabbath.
So what are we going to do? Are we going to open our shoe stores on Saturdays? Because now we're in this. Now I can move my shoe store into the ghetto onto the main street of Berlin, and can I keep it closed on Saturday and open it on Sunday? I can't do that. Berlin is very Christian still. What's that?
Because of the laws, they wouldn't be able to open.
So I can't open on Sunday, but now do I have to, or should I open on Saturday? You see, it's a really huge problem. What else are the implications if I'm Jewish, I'm no longer living in the ghetto? Sabbath becomes an issue. What else becomes an issue, boys?
Food choices.
Housing.
Housing. Let's do food choices then. Food choices. If I'm in the ghetto, then I can always have kosher food. And I can still have it. It's not like I can't have kosher food if I move.
Harder to find.
Oh, but some guy will still be in the ghetto making me corned beef. I'll be fine. But what's the challenge? You are right that it may become harder.
As you're more and more assimilated, you tend to want to have the same foods that everyone else has, as you're not ostracized.
That's the problem. So let's say I open a shoe store in the main street of Paris. Now I'm Paris. So I have a shoe store, and let's say I don't know what to do about Saturday, but let's say I've got it open 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, and I bring a sandwich to work. Am I going to be able to eat with the jeweler who's next door, whose name is Topier or something like that? Monsieur Topier, who is Catholic? Am I going to be able to have lunch with him? Because he may say, come on, sit down, I'd love to have you. And my wife made a lovely shrimp cocktail. You can have that with me. Now what do? I got the store there, but do I have to say, no, I can't have that with you? Ooh, that doesn't seem nice.
I'm allergic.
I'm allergic. But then he says, fine, so I'll bring you a bologna sandwich tomorrow. So now, do you see the so I've complicated it because I don't know what I'm going to do on Saturdays with the store, and I'm complicated because I don't know what I'm going to do for lunch on Thursday.
Has managed to get a lovely board and invite you for Christmas.
Right. So I've got
Really having a problem.
I've got a real problem of commerce. Can I not be open on Saturday? That's tricky. 5 days a week, that's not enough. And then I've got the issue of sociability. You know, I can't eat with them.
You hire Christians.
Can't I? What?
You hired Christians to work Saturday.
Well, that's a maybe. I don't know. I don't know if I can do
Depends
that.
how strict you are. If
I
you're
don't
open
know,
at
but
all.
I don't know that. I don't know if I can do that. What else is a problem? I got sociability, I got food, what else?
Clothing, housing.
Look at these guys.
Clothing.
Guys in the Paris street. Oh my God.
You look different, you don't look like.
Yes, the problem is living in the ghetto, I can have a beard, and I can have these little side locks, I can wear a hat, I can dress the way I want. Now I've got to go on the streets of Paris. Can I be in Paris and not look like Parisians? You know, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So I got to consider my clothing. And if nothing else, I got to consider I'm going to have my head covered. Ooh, that doesn't look so
It
good.
seems to me they're all in black as well.
Right, well, so I got to figure out what am I going to wear? So I got problems of clothing, and I got challenges. Clothing, eating, food, what else?
Friends, acquaintance, girls.
Oh, great.
Men are married.
So now my son comes with me to the shoe store.
He married.
And Mademoiselle Soulière comes in with a beautiful foot, and he decides, his name is Beryl Cohen, and he falls in love with Ms. Soulière.
Dope.
Now what are we going to do? Now we really have a huge issue, right? Marriage. And what are the other issues? So I got clothing, I got food, I got
Are you raising
Holidays,
children?
what?
Education,
Education, yes. Go ahead.
sending children out into neighborhood schools.
Right, where are they gonna go to school? Up till now, they've been going to a Jewish school. They know all this stuff inside out. Now I'm gonna send them where?
St. Anne's.
Yeah. Can I do that? Because will they learn enough about Judaism?
Can't you
Well, I
teach
don't know.
Judaism in the home?
I don't know, maybe. I haven't done that up till now. I've had just a soul environment. I didn't need to worry about it so much, but that's right. What am I gonna do with the kids now? Where are they gonna go? Can they learn, do I want them learning French history, German history, math, geometry? What about learning Torah and Mishnah?
Well, and Jewish history that they would learn in those schools would be the opposite of,
Right, it would not even be nice.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So does everybody follow that? I get emancipation, but it's a mixed bag. Wait, let me, it's a mixed bag.
Yes.
yeah.
And I'm not so sure it's such a great idea. So, I really come up with some people who will say, I guess I get some people who will say yes, some Jews, and they'll say it with a big exclamation mark, you bet. Some who will say no, whoops, I still got that. Some no with a big exclamation mark, and some who will say, what are we gonna do? And it creates a huge challenge. So we can date this challenge to about the year 1800, let's say. Say it's around that, okay, because it's easy to remember, about 200 years ago. The Enlightenment sows the seeds, the emancipation comes in the years following 1800 in different places, but it's all Western Europe where this happens. And, oh my gosh, it throws everybody for a loop. So if the destruction of the temple threw people for a loop, this is another loop. This is like, oh, what are we going to do now? So let's look and see what some people did. The first response, not a, but one response is on the back side of that sheet. Everybody know Felix Mendelssohn? Who's Felix Mendelssohn?
Abraham.
No. Who's Felix Mendelssohn? A famous composer.
Right.
Guess what? His dad was Abraham Mendelssohn. His grandfather was Moses Mendelssohn. Hey, let's go back to the other sheet first. I skipped, all right? I'm sorry. So I want to show you here. Here's one response on the part of a guy named Moses Mendelssohn. You can see it's dated 1729 to 1786. So you see his dates. He lives through the French Revolution, American Revolution. He's German. And he's struggling with the Enlightenment. John Locke says we all have reason, and reason is the greatest thing that distinguishes us for who we are. We follow reason to believe who we are. And Mendelssohn's saying to himself, wait, if we all have reason, and we're all therefore kind of equal, he's saying, why should I be Jewish? Why not just be a human being? Why do you need all these distinctions, Jews, Christians? Let's just be human beings. Here's Mendelssohn. So, someone want to read it?
The Jew does not claim to be the only creature singled out by God for salvation. What he does claim is that he is the only one who can attain salvation in no other way.
So he's trying to work this through about why do I have to be Jewish at all? Go ahead.
All men must have been destined by their Creator to attain salvation. Are particular religions then unnecessary? Yes, for all peoples that do not have one.
Aha. So that's pretty hard to find in Europe in those days. Keep going.
But for the Jews, there already is a religion with specific dictates. In the opinion of all our rabbis, the laws of Judaism are binding only upon the Jewish people. All other peoples are merely required to abide by the law of nature.
By that he means that Judaism says, we're Jewish, it's our deal, we got to do that. But for everybody else, as long as you are good human beings, you believe whatever you like, you're good to go. The law of nature. Just everybody else has to be a good human being. As long as you're a good human being, you can dress it up any way you like, but as long as you're a good human being, it's okay. Now here comes the punchline.
We have no beliefs that are contrary to
Now
reason.
that's what he's got to say, because otherwise people are going to say, but it's primitive, just drop it. So he says, oh, but it's unique to us, we've got to do it. And also, We don't believe anything that's contrary to reason.
We added nothing to natural religion except our commandments and laws, and they too rest on reason.
Now, do you see what he's struggling with here? He's struggling with Locke, because Locke has said that the essence of being a human being is to use your reason. If you follow that, then that's all you need to use. You don't need religion. But Moses Mendelssohn does not want to give up on religion, so he's a little wary of this gift that's coming his way. He's not yet emancipated, by the way. He's not yet emancipated before that. But he can see that he's got to kind of, that the ground is shifting, and he's got to be able to say, yeah, but we should still be Jewish, shouldn't we? Yeah, we should. We should still be Jewish. Yeah, I think we should, because it's all based on reason anyway. But his son, over the page, is not so sure. Look at Abraham Mendelssohn's dates at the very bottom. 1776 to 1835. He lives through emancipation. And he lives and becomes a citizen of the part of Germany in which he lives. And now he's going to write a letter to his son, to his children actually, his daughter, and explain why he actually converts them to Christianity. Now that is a huge yes to emancipation. It's so good that it allows me to get out of this whole ghetto and get away from being a Jew at all. That's one response. Unbelievable, isn't it? So that's how you get Felix Mendelssohn being such a success, because he's no longer Jewish, so he can get into the musical schools and he can conduct the symphony and all that stuff. If he was some Jewish guy out of the ghetto, you can be sure you and I never would have heard of Felix Mendelssohn. And also he never would have gone to a school to learn how to play the music, classical music. They weren't playing this stuff in the ghetto. So you see how it's very complicated. Once you get out of the ghetto, there's a lot of, remember we said school education? So Abraham Mendelssohn could send his kids to a school where they can learn classical music, Bach, Beethoven and stuff. And then Handel. Let's read the letter. It's a little long, but I think it's worth reading, and then we'll get to the Jews more. So, my dear daughter, he writes this the day he baptizes her. It's astonishing, isn't it? Just astonishing. So, why don't you read it?
You have taken an important step, and in sending you my best wishes for the day and for your future happiness, I have it at heart to speak seriously to you on subjects hitherto not touched upon. Does God exist? What is God? Is he a part of ourselves, and does he continue to live after the other part has ceased to be? And where and how? All this I do not know, and therefore I have never taught you anything about it. But I know that there exists in me and in you and in all human beings an everlasting inclination towards all that is good, true, and right, and a conscience which warns and guides us when we go astray. I know it, I believe it, I live in this faith, and this is my religion.
Wow. So look what he's done. He's taken that notion of reason and all that, and Moses Mendelssohn said, oh, Judaism is based on reason, and he's just said, well, come to think of it, the core of it all is for us to understand that all human beings have an inclination towards all that is good, true and right, and conscience. And that's when you boil it all down to love your neighbor as yourself. That's all you really need. That's my religion. And he's saying to himself, you'll see in a minute, why does he come to this? I don't, Mendelssohn died when? 1786.
1835.
All right. So, no, Moses dies. So Abraham's just a little boy when he dies. So he doesn't know, his dad fortunately doesn't see what happens. Now, so he converts them, he has them baptized. Go to the right, this is all I can tell you about religion. You see that there?
Yeah.
All I know about it. But this will remain true as long as one man will exist in the creation, as it has been true since the first man was created. Now, here we go. Keep going. First, outward form.
The outward form of religion your teacher has given you is historical and changeable, like all human ordinances. Some thousands of years ago, the Jewish form was the reigning one, then the heathen form, and now it is the Christian. We, your mother and I, were born and brought up by our parents as Jews, and without being obliged to change the form of our religion, have been able to follow the divine instinct in us and in our conscience. We have educated you and your brothers and sister in the Christian faith, because it is the creed of most civilized people.
Keep going.
and contains nothing that can lead
See
you.
where I goes over, switches
Yeah.
back to the left, I did a cut and paste there.
And contains nothing that can lead you away from what is good, and much that guides you to love, obedience, tolerance, and resignation.
So this is not a full endorsement of Christianity.
Right.
He's saying, it's not bad. Judaism was on top, now Christianity is on top, and actually it's not such a bad religion. Now, he wouldn't have said that 50 years ago, because he was being oppressed by Christians. Now comes this. By pronouncing your confession of faith, i.e. being baptized, you have fulfilled the claims of society on you and obtained the name of a Christian. Now be what your duty as a human being demands of you, true, faithful, good, obedient, and devoted till death to your mother, and I may also say to your father, unremittingly attentive to the voice of your conscience, which may be suppressed but never silenced, and you will gain the highest happiness that is to be found on earth, harmony and contentedness with yourself. So what's he done? He's made a tactical decision. He believes that really being a Jew is now, I don't have to be a Jew anymore, and the essence of it all is love your neighbor as yourself. Frankly, he says, Christianity is not all that different if you take away all the trappings. And the other thing that he's just done by baptizing his children is he bought them the key to modernity. Because now if they're Christians, in name, remember he just says in name, they can go to the school, they can dress the way they want, and Felix can study Handel and Bach, and Felix can become what he was to become. As I forget what happened with Dorothea, I think is her name. I think she was Fanny. I don't remember what happened. But you get the idea, right? It's not an endorsement of Christianity. This is just, let me out of here. Just let me out of here, and I'm happy to be out of here. So that is, in fact, and there were a number of Jews who just said, we don't have to stay in the ghetto anymore. Drop the clothes, give me that ham sandwich, and I'm out of here. And I'm out of here because I want to be free. I want to go to school, and I want to write music, and I want to write poetry, and I want to be part of the army, or I want to run for politics, and I want to have a store that's more successful than being stuck in this little ghetto. I want to have a store and a chain of hat stores in Paris, which I could never do if I was a Jew. Do you get it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a huge, like, you open the door to the ghetto, and some people run out and say, we're out of here. But you know, because we just don't want any more of it. But some Jews say, no, we're not leaving. These guys. Now they look like this. But the Orthodox say, we're not leaving. We're going to stay, and I mean, we'll recognize that we live in a modern world, and we'll maybe venture out and do a little bit more business, but we're not going to change how we live and how we mark our days. We're going to stay separate, because that's who we are. So you've got some running out, goodbye, Charlie, and some saying, we're not leaving. And then you get some people who say, there's got to be a way to, well, new page. There's got to be a way to reform Judaism, which means to adapt it, to change it. There's got to be a way to do it. And that's what Reform Judaism is all about. This is the beginnings of Reform Judaism, It comes around in the early 1800s, and it grows over the course of that century. So you see what it is then? There's this huge crisis. The first crisis was the destruction of the temple. The response is, there's a hole in the bucket, let's fill it and create rabbinic Judaism. The next crisis is modernity, which says, enlightenment, emancipation, modernity, what are we going to do to it? How do we survive? And some Jews just say, we're out of here. Some say, we're not touching it. The Reform Jews come along to say, wait, there's got to be a way to respond and remain who we are. So, comments, questions? Kind of cool, huh? So that's where Reform Judaism comes from, an attempt to respond to modernity, an attempt to respond to modernity. Now, how do you go about doing this? Because you've got it, well, we already said, what do you have to deal with? You have to deal with clothing, clothes, diet, education, education. I'm gonna say calendar, you know, that's like,
Yeah.
because it's not really just the Sabbath, right? It's all the holidays.
Right.
Clothing, diet, education, calendar,
Other people,
what?
other people.
Marriages.
Oh, yeah, okay. Marriage, well, that would be education, I think. There's another one that came to mind though. Oh, I know, worship. I don't know how many of you have ever been in an Orthodox synagogue, but it does look a little strange. It's not like Episcopalian worship,
I'm a little faster in the mosque.
right? Because if you've been to a service in a Christian context of late, then you have noticed people sit rather quietly, don't they? And there's an order of service and everybody reads it or sings it and it's all in unison. If you've ever been to an Orthodox traditional Jewish service, it's the exact opposite aesthetic. It's noisy and loud and people are praying at their own rate and it's all in Hebrew. Some finish early, some finish late. And the guys who finish early talk with the guys who are over there because it's a different aesthetic. It's just a totally different aesthetic. It's like if you go to the Springfield Symphony on a Saturday night, there's a certain aesthetic, right? Everybody gets there on time, sits straight, applauds, total silence while the orchestra plays, and then applauds, and then it's like very structured. But if you go to a rock concert in the same place the next night, what's it like there?
Loud.
If the music is loud,
Yeah.
the audience is just as loud as the music, and they're singing and swaying and all kinds of stuff. It's a different aesthetic. But if you live in Germany and you're Jewish, the last thing, what are you going to do now that you finally made friends with Otto, who owns that shop next door to you? Are you going to, and he says, you want to come to church with me? Well, you go, and it's an organ, and it's like dead silent the whole time, right? It's really like, ooh, they start on time and they end on time, right?
We don't always end on time.
Yeah, you do. It's always on time.
No, we don't. Trust me.
So it's always on time, and it's always neat, right? And then he's gonna invite Otto to his service. It starts at 9 a.m. and goes till 1 p.m. And people come and go, and oh, you gotta do something with this worship.
But you also have the women sitting in the center of the.
Oh my God, women! Women! Yeah,
Boy, that's-
gender issue. Oh. So there's a real huge issue here, and Reform Judaism arises to say to people like Abraham Mendelssohn, this is not necessary. There is a way for us to continue as we are. What we have to do is get to the core. We've got to figure out what's critically central to who we are and accept the other stuff as being add-ons. Okay? So, here is a chart which sort of talks about some of this stuff. And we'll talk some more. So the hint is, some of you may have been to Sinai Temple back in the day with to the Black congregation or to other Reform congregations, and you may have noticed, come to think of it, it looks like Christian worship, a little bit. Because everybody, you know, we start 8 p.m., I got an eye on the clock, I know when I'm ending. The service is longer than the Christian service, that cannibalism. But everybody at Sinai Temple, the Reformed congregation here in town, we read in unison. No one chats when I'm talking. And it's like, it's organized. How come? Because Reformed Judaism began in Germany, and it began next door to the Lutheran Church. Or it began in Paris, and the Catholic Church is sort of like that also, or wherever. The Christian mode is altogether different. So let's take a look and see. So this is sort of a setup. It makes Orthodoxy the fall guy in this little chart, so I don't like that too much. But so in the Orthodox synagogue, in the classic historic synagogue, okay, the ritual was entirely in Hebrew, and Now, this makes Orthodoxy into a fall guy. If I was an Orthodox Jew, I wouldn't call it long and repetitious. There are a lot of repeating, and it is long, but that sort of denigrates it. It's a long service with all prayers chanted, organ and mixed choir, forget it. And there's a different aesthetic. I wouldn't call it a lack of decorum. I call it a different aesthetic. Think rock concert or coffee house. Now, someone want to read what it says about the Reformed service? Go ahead. Go ahead.
All Hebrew service difficult to follow. Service lengthy because of repetition. Rapid chanting made worship unintelligible. Performers soft, inspired synagogue music. A shorter service than the choir.
All right, so imagine Abraham Mendelsohn says, I'm out of here, I'm converting my kids to Christianity, I'll never see you again. And others do as well. Reform Jews who come along and say, wait, let's think about this service. It is long, it does have repetitions, all chanted, it's all in Hebrew. Does it have to be that way? And they do a lot of research and look back in Jewish history and say, no, the service hasn't always been this way. There's always been some change. So they adapt and reform the service. They say, we're going to cut out some repetitions, we're going to add what they call the vernacular, the language of the people, and we're going to add an organ. God, it sounds great in church, let's add it in the synagogue as well. So Reform worship comes, and we're also going to add some more decorum. So they say, the Reformers say, you don't have to leave and go to church to get a shorter service that you can understand with nice music. You can come to us still, and we can provide you the music, the brevity, etc., etc. And that, in part, is what happens through the 1800s. The service is reformed. And the process goes on to this day. People are always kind of playing with it, reforming the service. But you get I think, does everyone get the drift here?
Yeah.
And the idea is, now you maybe can bring Otto to your service, because there'll be Hebrew, but he won't find it completely foreign. It's just a little bit more modern. Let me do one more. Let's do the Sabbath one. So traditionally, there's no riding to the synagogue permitted on Sabbath. You don't have a car. You just don't, you stick to foot. Sabbath rest prohibited many types of activities. Like you wouldn't have a store open on Sabbath. Let's just do those. So, as time goes by, some Jews, if they're not living in the ghetto, will say, well, why do we have to live in the ghetto? We don't have to stay here. Why can't I buy a nicer house 5 blocks down where Otto lives? The trouble is that's a long way now to walk back on the Sabbath. So someone's going to say, well, can I walk on the Sabbath if I'm going to the service on the Sabbath? And some people say, yes, you can. You're going to walk to get to the service, or you're going to ride, or you're going to drive. As long as you're going to the synagogue, it's a go. That's a reform of Jewish practice, but it allows for a different feel. Now, another thing will happen with the Sabbath. Here they say modern conditions required many to work on the Sabbath, thus preventing them from attending worship. Now you got a problem. What if you don't own this shoe store, but you want to get out of the ghetto? Otto owns the shoe store, and you just want to get a job working for Otto because you can make more money than you could in the ghetto. So you go to work for Otto, and he says, but you got to work Saturday mornings for me. Well, if I'm Orthodox, I'm just going to say, sorry, Otto, I can't. And the Reform movement will come along and say, well, maybe there's a way in which we can kind of make this work. So one option will be to say, let's create a more major Friday night service. So that's why at Sinai Temple, there's a late night Friday service every week. Sometimes we just have an early one, but at 8 p.m. The idea being, we know that we could say you shouldn't go to work Saturday morning, but you're going to. So let's be realistic here. We'll offer a Sabbath service on Friday night, so that if you need to, we'll still have one on Saturday morning, but if you need to, you can go to work on Saturday morning. We'll make it manageable. and we'll reform Judaism to the extent that we need to. Does that follow? So that is what happens. There's lots more here, but well, let's look at the traditional prayer one, then I want to stop and leave time for some questions, okay? In the traditional prayer service, that's the second category there is praying for the coming of a personal Messiah, right, who will deliver the Jews from exile and restore them to the land of Israel. It's a classic prayer. Send the Messiah, he'll take us all from all the countries we live in, take us all back to live in the land of Israel. And then we'll see the temple rebuilt, and we'll restore the sacrifices, and just go with those, okay? That's the traditional prayer. If you go to an Orthodox service today, they're praying for that right now. Wait a second. I just got emancipated. I can be a citizen. And you want me to include in my prayer book a prayer that says, "Dear God, please send me somebody to take me out of Germany when I can finally be a citizen of Germany." Well, the early reformers said, this is just something that is past its time. It is not necessary for us to fulfill ourselves and go live in Israel. We can be Jews fully in Germany, Paris, England, or France, or wherever we want. So praying that we're going to leave is just something we're not going to do. So they cut it out of the prayer book. They said it is not core to who we are. We're not going to pray for a personal Messiah to take us to Jerusalem and for the sacrifices to be resumed. We're just not going to do that. So they cut it out. And pray for peace and other kinds of things. You don't pray for that. You're a reformed worship service. So if you cut some of those things out, and certain repetitions also, then the service went from being this long to being this long. And you add some vernacular language, and you're already playing on the same playing field as others. So the reform of Judaism came about in order to respond to modernity and allow someone to be both modern and Jewish. So, questions, comments, thoughts?
I have relatives that came over in the early
I think we can close the air conditioning off now.
Are you cold?
No, we can't hear. I'm not hearing as well. You're not hearing, so let's just try it. And actually, why don't we open the door to the hallway and... Can we open a window?
Yeah.
Are there screens?
warm out.
Oh, let's do that. Okay, well, thank you. All right, so we can hear each other. Okay.
I have relatives that came over from,
Thanks.
first we can figure it was probably Austria at that time,
Yeah,
in the 1840s.
Yeah.
And then around the 1900s, basically to escape the persecution and go for the opportunities in America.
correct, yeah.
So they, some of them were reformed, some are conservative, and I have some relatives now that are conservative and some that are basically non-observant anyway. I'm somewhere between. But
Do
they
you have a
were
question?
basically escaping, but a lot of the adapting with the reform movement is to go for the freedoms, go for the opportunities. So this is how a lot of people came into the United States, no matter what their religious background.
Well, I think you're putting two things together.
But
Jews who
for
came
my
here-
family, they came
They didn't come because they were Reformed Jews, they came for freedom.
for freedom,
And they could have
and they,
been Orthodox, they could have been any number of things, they just wanted to get out.
well, some of them were reformed.
Maybe.
My grandmother's parents observed Christmas, which kind of threw me a little when I found that out. I didn't know that, but he was
So,
very,
let's- all right,
very
so let's-
assimilated.
Let's get a little more specific then. The changes I'm describing take place in Western Europe. The emancipation the Enlightenment touches Western Europe, and the emancipation takes place in Western Europe. So the change for reform comes in Western Europe. That's like maybe as far as Hungary and Italy and Denmark and Sweden and Germany and England. In France, did I say that? Okay? That's where in Austria. So that's where the reform movement takes root, because that's where Jews are emancipated and they need to respond to modernity. So one response is, let's go for it and let's in fact stop being Jewish, which we saw in Abraham Mendelssohn. And another response is, no, we're not interested, we value what we have and we're not leaving. And then the in-between response is to try and moderate this and figure out a way to make it work. So the first guys out of the gate come to be known as the Reform Jews. They try and reform Judaism and change it to make it livable. And then there is a group of Jews who say, you guys are going too far, let's be just a little bit more conservative. And that leads to a movement called conservative Judaism. So if you happen to go near the X and drive up Dickinson towards the JCC, on Dickinson Street there are two synagogues. As you're driving towards the JCC, on the left is Temple Beth El, which is conservative, and on the right is Sinai Temple, which is Reform. From the outside you can't tell, I mean, what's the difference? But loosely, if you were to go inside either of them, you'd see that Reform is more liberal, and the conservative are more conservative. And like all things, when a process begins, things, there's no central hierarchy in Judaism. So some Reform Jews sort of follow the pattern of Abraham Mendelssohn, and they were reforming and changing, and then before you knew it, their kids had said, well, let's just not be Jewish anymore. So Reform arose as an attempt to stop assimilation, but some people could use it as a route or a slide into assimilation. But I don't think it's that. Anything can be misused or abused. So, and the conservative movement is just a little more conservative. That follow for
What
everybody?
would be the difference between, like, how would I know the difference between conservative and reform?
Excuse me, if you walked into a conservative synagogue, if I brought these guys here, you know immediately I'm not them.
Conservative.
I'm not, these are Orthodox.
But,
These are Orthodox.
I'm not Orthodox, you know
Right.
that because of the dress. But if you and I went to an event, for example, at the Jewish Community Center last night, and there were it was a Jewish community event, so there were a lot of Jews there. You could never tell the difference, just hanging out there, the difference between a Reformer and a conservative Jew.
Well,
Wait, hang on just for a second. You couldn't tell the difference. Now but you couldn't tell the difference, because everyone's dressed modern. Where you could tell the difference is if you went in and watched the worship in the two different places.
Okay.
So at Sinai Temple, you would immediately know it's not Orthodox, because we start on time and we pray in unison, and it's way more like church, to be really honest.
yeah.
It's more like that. If you go to the conservative synagogue, you would find it more kind of a combination of both the Orthodox and the Reform. Because they kind of, there's a lot more Hebrew. They kind of chant a lot more, but they do have English. And for example, their rabbi now is a woman, which tells you something about Germany.
about the
And,
change.
and if you looked more closely in their prayer book, but if you just walked in, you'd say, oh, this is not Reform. And if you knew, it's not Orthodox either. So that's sort of, it's a
Yeah, that
little
makes
hard
sense.
to tell. Yes?
My question was, did the Reformation allow for baptism?
Which Reformation?
The Reformation of Jews, did it allow any of them to be baptized?
No.
No, no, because baptism makes you a Christian. So Jews weren't becoming Christians, except for Abraham Mendelssohn. But that was an organized plan of the Jewish community. Okay, so you gotta be careful. You have to be careful. I would not call what happened here the Reformation of Judaism. It's interesting. The term, the Reformation, is only owned by one historic event. The Reformation refers to what happened in 1517 and thereafter, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But
Trademark.
what's that? It's,
Trademark.
if it could be, it'd be trademark term. So, but the Reformation was a way in which the world of Christianity was reformed, right? And it goes on through this day. And similarly, you could say, in the 1800s, emancipation, and then the Enlightenment and the emancipation the modern world required a reform of Judaism. And the reform of Judaism led to Reform Judaism. Yes?
Did the Zionist movement come about as a reaction to Reform Judaism?
No. So the Zionist movement is the movement which claims that there ought to be a Jewish state, and the Zionist movement Zionism set about creating and building the Jewish state. So Zionism did not begin in that way. There's a small z, let me just do it this way, okay? To make it look like this, there's Zionism, whoops. Okay? There is a Zionism running all the way through Judaism ever since the year 70. It's there in those Orthodox prayers. We want the Messiah to come, bring us all back to Israel, reestablish the Davidic monarchy, rebuild Jerusalem. That's a Zionist component that runs through every page of traditional Judaism from the year 70 onwards.
Okay, so that's-
It's always there, and every Seder, every Passover Seder always ends with the phrase, next year in Jerusalem. So there's a huge, small z, Zionist aura or dimension to Judaism, right? When the Reform Judaism came along, that was something that Reform said, we just don't want that to be a part of who we are anymore, because we don't think it's essential to who we are. We can live where we are in Paris or London and be happy where we are, right? So that's the Reform movement. Parallel to all this in the 1800s, we're in the 1800s, there comes to be something called nationalism. And the Italians begin to say, you know, why can't we have Italy for the Italians and build a sovereign state? Unite all these little principalities in that boot and make a country called Italy. And a little bit north of that, all those German principalities and all that, a lot of people say, why do we have so many separate little entities? Why can't we bind them all together and create something called Germany? So the Italians say, we want Italy, an Italy. The Germans say, we want a Germany. The Greeks say, we want a Greece. And Poles are sort of caught in between, but they're working towards some kind of Polish identity. Everybody's talking nationality and nationalism in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So guess what? If everybody else is doing it, then a certain number of Jews start to say, you know, we've got this Zionism thing, it runs all the way through everything we've ever, all the way through our tradition. The Italians are getting ready to push towards sovereignty. Why don't we do the same? And that's how Zionism with a capital Z gets created, as a self-conscious attempt to say, we're not going to wait for the Messiah, but we're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to create a Jewish state. And the early reformers want nothing to do with this. Reform is anti-Zionist for a long time, not anymore, but for quite a long time. That sort of, so it's a different stream of Jewish expression. Kind of cool, isn't it? If you remember at the end of Fiddler on the Roof, if you've seen the movie when Anatevka breaks up, some of the Jews, they're all leaving, and who's going where? Do you remember?
New York, Chicago, Toronto.
Yeah, some of them are going to New York, Chicago, Toronto, because that's where their relatives already are. And a couple are saying, I'm going to Israel. But only a small number, because it's 1880, 1890 or something. This is like really, you gotta be crazy to go to Palestine then, or dedicate it, right? It's really, really hard. So only a small minority will go and do that. But they are tough, and they build a country in the end. So just one other thing. The changes we're talking about, remember, of the Enlightenment and Emancipation, all happened in Western Europe. Over in Eastern Europe, where Tevye lives, and Anatevka, Fiddler on the Roof, and that little shtetl, they are as backwards as can be. They are, without being harsh, they're medieval Jews. It's a medieval Judaism that they're living. And they don't have any of this stuff happening, except a little bit, if you know the movie well enough, there's a little inkling of modernity. How does it come in?
Sewing machine.
There's a sewing machine, but that doesn't break the aura of the tradition. There's something else that comes.
The daughter married.
No, but that follows something else.
Education.
That follows something else. Somebody has a newspaper.
Oh.
Remember there's a guy who gets a newspaper and it comes in Russian,
Yeah.
and he's the only one who can read it.
Not
So he
allowed.
reads, well, everybody can read.
No, but I mean, you're not allowed to have a newspaper?
No, but nobody could read Russian.
No.
They just read, they knew Jewish languages. But he's got a Russian language paper, he brings it. That's the scent, from the outside world. And he all of a sudden can read to people about stuff happening in Paris, in Germany, in Rome. And in fact, when Tevye's daughter wants to marry, she wants to marry Motel, the tailor. Tevye says, what? And they say, we're already engaged, Tata,
Yeah.
father, we're already engaged. He says, what do you think this is? Paris? Rome? Because he knows something's happening over there that's not happening in Anatevka. He says, what do you think this is, Paris or Rome? You go engage yourselves? That's not possible, etc. So in Eastern Europe, it's very, very modest. There's a little bit of enlightenment, just a little bit. It's there in different ways. That's a whole other story. Great story for another time. So here's Reform Judaism. And if you, it's not Reformed Judaism, it continues to grow, and the Reform Judaism I grew up with in the 1950s is not the Reform Judaism that I know now. So for example, when I grew up in Reform Judaism in the 1950s, they sang English hymns. There's one, all the world shall come to praise you, da 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 da. I don't know it because the truth is I grew up in a very traditional Reform congregation, but I know of it. So they had English hymns and stuff like that. And you can't find a Reform congregation in the world, no, in North America, that sings English hymns anymore. Maybe, or if there are 1,000, maybe 2. But back in the day, there was a hymnal, and they sang what sounded like hymns. So if there are 1,000 congregations today, there are maybe 2 out of 1,000 that sing hymns anymore. You will find English being sung, but in contemporary songs for different purposes. But the Reform that I grew up of the 1950s, with hymns and predominantly English, has given way to largely a lot of Hebrew and a very different kind of music. No organs way on the way out. It's going. So at my synagogue, when I got there at Sinai Temple, the organ was there at every Sabbath service in 1988, and now we only use it on 2 days a year, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
It's too bad.
That's me.
Do they have any instrumental music?
Guitar.
Yes.
Oh.
Or we have a keyboard person plays piano. We went to piano as opposed to organ. So we really went from organ to piano, and it just so happens that our cantor plays guitar, but the predominant instrument is piano. It's a huge difference, right?
Yes.
I mean, think about it. If you run a service with an organ or piano, is a totally different statement about worship and a lot of other things.
Yeah.
So the Reform movement has changed from the 50s then, from organ and hymns and English to a very different kind of expression, and much more hospitable towards Zionism and things like that. So when I think a number of you may be making the trip to New York City, we're going to visit Temple Emmanuel, which is the ultimate expression of what they call classical Reform Judaism. It's the 2 out of 1,000 congregations that still worships the way they used to in 1950. They even use the prayer book of 1950.
It's not the
I will show it to you
synagogue?
when no. I will show, if you're with me on this trip, I'll show you their prayer book, and you'll see this is not the prayer book that's used anywhere else almost. Because they've held on to, I said in the advertising, it looks like a cathedral, and it talks like a cathedral, and it sort of feels like a cathedral. It's a very, very different place.
What happened that made them stop using the organ? It must have been.
No, they didn't.
I
Which one?
thought,
No,
I thought
it-
you said that when your childhood, or when you were growing
Oh,
up,
oh,
they had organs.
right.
And they used them in worship, and then like at your synagogue.
We don't.
You don't.
Okay, I thought
What caused that?
that change from organ to piano,
Just the rabbis?
but
What
why?
you wanted?
No, the question is why? Because the organ in the Reformed congregation went along with the hymns, went along with a kind of formality and starchiness that didn't seem right. It didn't work.
It's the kind
So I'm
of
thinking
thing
it didn't,
set
it didn't work, because also, what came is that baby boomers came of age. And baby boomers were not starchy shirt and tie, organ, hymn singing people. Baby boomers are guitar and no shirt and tie and a different aesthetic. It's a different aesthetic.
No
tie.
shirt?
No,
No.
tie and jacket.
I know.
It's a different aesthetic. So as the aesthetic changes, the organ moves to the piano, and in many congregations, I'd be happy if it was just the guitar, personally. So it's just a different aesthetic. It's a baby boomer aesthetic.
Why the move
It's a
then?
Woodstock aesthetic. It is a Woodstock aesthetic. That's what
Why
it
the
is.
move then from
So,
the
I'm sorry, so let me just say,
vernacular?
when we go to Temple Emmanuel, that place has a certain, how shall I say, when you get there, you'll see, it's just got a certain style and views itself as so fancy schmancy that they could never imagine changing. I don't even know if I have the words to describe why they haven't changed.
That's a Monday, though, you won't be having a service, right?
No, but you'll walk in and you'll say, blah, blah, blah. You'll go, well, you walk in and it looks like a cathedral, so you won't say anything, because the cathedral looks like a cathedral too. But they didn't change because they're very upper class, very fancy schmancy.
New Yorkers.
And I don't even know how the words, why did they not change? It's because,
They don't have to.
well, no, they don't want to.
Yeah.
The question is, why don't they want to?
No.
It's because they see themselves as establishment. They are the establishment with a capital E, and the establishment does what it wants, it stays where it wants, it stays
Maybe
where it
they
wants.
think of that as going backwards.
Yes, they would consider it being,
Well, New York,
Yeah,
that's New York
that's
City, though.
What
so-
instruments are used in conservative and orthodox? You're in,
well, the Orthodox, they don't use any still
okay.
on the Sabbath. And in the conservative here in town, they would play the organ on the Sabbath.
I've
They
been
would.
in
Wait,
a
wait.
few conservative
Elliot,
ones, and
wait,
they actually
hey.
play guitar.
They would, yeah. Elliot?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a little bit of reaction, maybe more like the dominant culture of the Christian culture, coming more like the dominant culture of the Christian culture, and there's a movement back to retain some of the more Judaism or some of the roots.
Yes, so the other reason that Reform changed, aside from the Woodstock and baby boomers, is that the baby boomers all grew up in the 1960s when another movement saying, we gotta be who we are, got traction. And what movement was that? What change was there sometime in the 1960s and 70s in America of another ethnic group saying, it's time for us to claim our rights and claim our heritage? No, Black, African Americans, right? Negroes became blacks, became African Americans. So in the 1960s and 70s, when that movement of black awareness and black consciousness took place, that also had its reflection in the Jewish world, where Jews said, we've got to reclaim some of our pride and some of our essential and core traditions and rituals. So that's the other piece that comes along with it. There's other stuff too, but that's one of the things that comes up. So it's a very complex change, very complex.
As we talk, thinking of a Seder that I experienced in Iceland with the military in the early 1950s.
Oh, yes.
And the rabbi was flown in from San Antonio to Keflavik, Iceland.
Yes.
And there was no sacramental wine. So Budweiser beer was
It was blessed.
and there happened to be a kid from Springfield whose dad ran the Pomona market here, who was the only one of the Jews attending who could answer the four questions. And the rabbi was very pleased that Billy Cohen was able to
I think he probably was, yes.
to come up with the answer, and we did some singing. Ya ha God ya.
How do you remember that? Ha God ya, ha God ya. Have you been to another Seder since?
Pardon me?
Have you been to another Seder since?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
we've
okay, okay.
experienced
Just checking, that's pretty good that you would remember that.
But none with Budweiser.
No, well, too bad. You never know what can happen. So I hope you.
I'm sure that the group that was there, and there were kids from Long Island and New England and so on, it seemed to me like a very relaxed, open, it must have been a reformed
No ED in the end.
gathering, because there was, apart from the questions and the singing, there was not a lot of severity or formality.
Well, I would like to, I think you've raised a really important issue. And I don't think I would say that that was a reform Seder. I would say it was probably a sloppy, not much of a Seder. Well, that's what it was. It wasn't a reform Seder. If it had no substance and not much rigor, then it wasn't a reform Seder.
Okay.
It was nothing. Or it was just, it was a gesture.
Yeah.
So because I sometimes will hear people say, well, I'll hear Jewish people say this. I say, I'm not very Jewish, I'm just Reformed. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, but Reform Judaism is not the default. Reform Judaism is an expression of Judaism with its own traditions and validity and rituals and what have you. And if someone's not an observant Jew, doesn't mean they're a Reformed Jew, it means they're not an observant Jew. That's what it means. So you didn't mean to say all that, but I'm just saying that that's something that I'm aware of, that Reform's not the default. You know, it's...
Have you ever heard anyone say I'm a Jewish Christian?
Yes, but you can't be that. You can say it, but you can't be it. The two don't go hand in hand.
Okay.
So that's a comment. You got to be. I want to be really careful not to suggest that Reform says anything goes. It's potentially that anything goes. That's true, but the movement is very careful about saying, hey, we do have, you know, there are boundaries here. The boundaries change, of course. You know.
Well, this may have been an accommodation.
I bet it was.
To,
Yeah, because they probably didn't have a book there, a Haggadah there. So the rabbi's sort of strapped, he just wants to offer Jews a chance to get together.
yeah.
Yeah. So you could say, now the Reform movement then has gone back towards more traditional expressions, hence no more hymns and no more organ and just a lot more Hebrew and what have you. On the other hand, the Reform movement is very progressive. So it was the Reform movement that first ordained women as rabbis. And it's the Reform movement that first ordained or allowed for there to be, for someone to be forthrightly gay and be ordained. Because the Reform movement definitely ordained gay rabbis, but when they were ordained, they had to not admit that they were gay. Because if they did, then they wouldn't be ordained. But the Reform movement since changed the practice, so if you're gay, then it's not an obstacle towards your being ordained. So the Reform movement is on the forefront of certain areas, and those are two of them.
So that come along.
Gender issues and sexuality
They'll
issues.
come a longer way than Catholicism.
It's different. It's different.
Well, no, because you said
That
that
that is
they're
true.
gay,
Well,
and if you admit you're
but
gay,
I don't
you
wanna
cannot be.
But I don't want to be unfair to my Catholic friends. We are who we are, and they who are they are, and their church does what they do, and we do what we do. So I don't know that we're farther. If we should, we just don't want to cast aspersions. One thing I forgot to say, which is, one of the core things of Reform Judaism, one of the core things, that is what's sometimes called prophetic Judaism. The commitment to ethics and the teaching of the prophets. So when I was a little boy, and in the 1950s, if one thing everybody knew, there was a song, it went something, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's the chorus. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And that's who?
Micah.
That's the prophet Micah. So that, if you had to say, what was the core, or what was a core constituent part of Reform Judaism? Still is. It's what's called prophetic Judaism, ethics. So Reform Jews are always first in line when it comes to matters of social justice. More so than conservative, more so than Orthodox.
What's the word again, please?
Prophetic, like Prophetic, as in prophet. So Reform Jews are first and foremost into prophetic Judaism, very much so. Okay, it's 8 o'clock, that's change.